Now, the main function, in a way, of this plenary is to have a look at the state of greenhouse gas removal, carbon dioxide removal. And Dr. Steve Smith has been the brains and the lead behind this effort with a fantastic team of others, of course. So it's my joyful task, actually, to introduce Steve. Now, what I could do is kind of give you his bio. That's normally what you do when you're introducing someone. But Steve looked rather petrified this morning when I said to him, I've just had quite a good metaphor I think I can use to introduce you. And for me, Steve is a bit like the Clark Kent of greenhouse gas removal. He's unflappable, unassuming, just a super nice guy, until you realize that underneath that shirt of his is a blazing intellect and some big biceps too. And so Super Steve is going to tell us about where we are and what we need to do. I guess I kind of actually do have to say something about him, other than being a super nice guy and a very smart individual. He's executive director of CORE. He's also the executive director of Oxford Net Zero. He's pioneered a bunch of things in both of those initiatives, including a major stocktake globally of net zero pledges. We pinched him from the UK government, the BEIS, the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, as it then was. And before that, he was head of climate science at the Committee on Climate Change, or head of science. And he's an Oxford man, but he did skip off to our friends and loved ones at Imperial College London for his PhD in atmospheric physics. A little known fact about Steve, other than that he's really Clark Kent, is that he helped write the Climate Crisis for Beginners books for Usborne, the kids. And he's contributed to the Lady Bird book on climate change. So he's teaching grown-ups, he's teaching children, and like Clark Kent, he's happily married with 2 kids of his own. So Steve, I welcome you to the floor. Thank you very much. Sorry to be so long.
Wow, what an introduction. How do I follow that? I think I vaguely resemble that person. And I certainly won't be taking off my shirt, so you're all relieved, so I won't do that. So yeah, can I just add my welcome to all of you? This conference has been months, or actually years, in the making. And there's been a wonderful team of people. Some of you in the room helped us steer this. Many of you helping on the logistics, Anna and Michael and team. And it's just really, really nice to see you all in person in the room. So I really hope that you're inspired, you learn a lot this week, you catch up with some old friends, make some new ones, and have a really enjoyable week. So yeah, it's my task to do a bit of scene setting just in this opening talk. And you may be aware that we published a second edition of the State of Carbon Dioxide Removal just a couple of weeks ago. So this is still fairly hot off the press. And I thought maybe it would be helpful for me to just take you through some of the key findings from that report, but also point to some of the loose ends, some of the open questions, because I think all of you in this room, you're the best placed people to poke at those loose ends, to tie some of them off, to discuss them, and to find out how we can do better and have even better information. So that's what I'm going to try and do, and I will make sure there's a bit of time for questions before we all go off for coffee and the parallel sessions. So the state of CDR really covers how much is going on, what is CDR, where are we now, what might we need to get to as part of meeting our climate goals, but then also looking at, well, what's the state of the sector and what can we learn that might tell us where we're headed. But just carbon dioxide removal 101, I don't think I need to tell you any of this stuff, but this is something that we find we do need to tell the outside world when we're talking to people who don't live and breathe this stuff. Of course, carbon dioxide removal is really any method which is a human intervention, so it's additional to natural processes. We know that the natural world is lending us a huge hand in absorbing about half of our emissions year by year. So we're talking about something that's additional to that captures CO2 from the atmosphere and stores it durable. So there's really 3 important components. So there's a human intervention, additional to natural processes. The CO2 is coming from the atmosphere, so we're talking about different things to conventional fossil CCS, for instance. And we store it durably, so we're not just capturing CO2 from the air directly or from biomass and turning it into something where the CO2 ends up back in the atmosphere like a fuel. All those things are kind of CDR adjacent. They're all part of the overall carbon cycle, what we do to it, and part of the solution set. So there will be talks throughout the week that I think touch on some of these adjacent areas. And of course, about capture of removal of other greenhouse gases, non-CO2 greenhouse gases, such as methane and nitrous oxide. But that CDR is what we're focused on now. And of course, there's a whole panoply of ways of doing this. We did this quite complicated, but hopefully quite pretty and useful chart to outline the 15 different methods for carbon dioxide removal that we look at in the state of CDR. You're welcome to take a look and kind of try and spy your favorite one. This isn't an entirely complete set, but this is a pretty complete set of the ones that we think are in the literature and certainly at least at sort of pilot stage in the real world at the moment. And you can see there are a bunch of different methods, and they all have very different characteristics in terms of, for instance, how you capture the CO2 from the atmosphere. You see a capture process column there, where the carbon ultimately ends up. So you can see the carbon storage pool. And then also, of course, how ready they are. So what stage of technology development are they at? How big might they become in terms of their potential to help solve the climate problem, the mitigation potential, and the durability or the characteristic timescale of storage of that carbon removal method. And so we sort of color-coded, and you can see there's not really, I mean, there's huge variation. There's not a huge amount of rhyme or reason, except maybe broadly there's a bit of a trade-off between those methods which are largely ready, they're largely at scale. We arguably wouldn't really call them technologies. They're sort of well-established practices, like tree planting. Those things are already kind of routinely done. They're routinely reported generally by countries in their national greenhouse gas inventories. And so they're at scale, but arguably less durable than some of these other methods which are newer, at an early stage of readiness. A lot of these ones which are more durable, they're sort of accessing the, let's say, the geological or the mineral component of Earth's carbon cycle. So rather than capturing things biologically and keeping them in biology, we're talking about rocks and minerals and geological carbon storage here, which looks to be more durable. But there's potential right across the gamut of these methods. I'd say one of the loose ends is defining what counts as sufficiently durable, right? So the IPCC definition of carbon removal is that it must be durable, but it's not spelled out by the IPCC or others what is sufficiently durable. Some people might say it's got to be these geological things, everything else is not durable. We deliberately took a broad approach in the report just to try and not prematurely cut things out. And so we do go down to the sort of decades to centuries timescale with durable wood products, for instance. It's pretty clear that these things have climate value. It's also pretty clear that there's greater value in terms of climate outcome for the more durable storage. The more durable it is, the better. But where we draw that line, I think, is still an open question in the research community and in the sort of policy and decision-making community as well. But that's an overview of the methods. And then the question becomes, well, how much is going on? And this is a non-trivial question. You can immediately start to see why it's non-trivial from looking at this photo, a kind of standard woodland scene. You can see there's some stuff here which doesn't look managed. It's pretty natural. No one's really paying too much attention to this. There's some trees that look like they were planted several decades ago. Of course, an issue we have that with the land in particular, what's going on in the carbon cycle is a really complex convolution now of natural sources and sinks and human activities. So how do we actually define how much carbon dioxide removal is going on? Well, if we just start with the basic physics and the basic carbon cycle, we know broadly that we have a geological bucket of carbon, a terrestrial bucket, an oceanic bucket, and of course, a lot is ending up in the atmosphere right now. And so it's non-trivial to actually measure the fluxes in and out of these buckets, but conceptually, these are pretty clear. We can separate a terrestrial flux from an oceanic flux. But of course, what we're interested in when we're looking at reporting emissions at the national level, at the corporate level, at the individual level, is the human component, the anthropogenic component. And there are actually two broad different ways in which this is tackled. One is the way that the national greenhouse gas inventories do it. And this is done on the basis of guidance produced by the IPCC. And it says, well, it's really, really hard in practice to disentangle the natural fluxes from the human-caused fluxes, especially on land, you have to make some assumptions about what's the natural, what's the anthropogenic. And you can imagine there are certain areas of land, the way that the IPCC has recommended doing it is saying you can demarcate the areas of land which you count as managed. And so you identify the managed land areas as a country, and all the fluxes you count as anthropogenic within those managed areas. Now, of course, that includes the direct fluxes from deforestation, afforestation, agricultural soil carbon, things like that. But there is a component of natural fluxes going on within those managed areas. Some areas are more managed than others, so some are sort of pretty natural. Also, of course, the carbon cycle is responding to the amount of CO2 we've dumped into the atmosphere. So we've got a whole load of indirect effects going on. The CO2 fertilization effect, which means that things are growing more and faster because of the CO2 loading in the atmosphere. But the IPCC has said, well, you demarcate the areas you think are managed, and then you count all those fluxes. That's your anthropogenic contribution. And from that, you can work out the sources and the sinks. And of course, the sinks, the durable sinks, particularly things going into managed forests, those would be what would be interested in terms of measuring CDR. But there is another way. This is the way that's followed by the Global Carbon Project, for instance. And that says we're not going to define areas of managed and non-managed land, but we're going to have what's called bookkeeping models. And we're going to record land use activities, and then we're going to use process-based models, so not direct measurements of fluxes on areas of land, but process-based models to tease out the direct anthropogenic component to land, and then we'll separate that out from the natural component on the land and oceans and atmosphere. So there are actually two different ways of looking at this problem at the moment, and particularly for land, this becomes very relevant. So let's start with the national inventories and see what they come up with. Well, if you sum up the carbon sinks on managed forests from the national inventories, you get a pretty large number for carbon removal going on at the moment. This is the trend for the 21st century, and you can see that averaging 6 to 7 billion tons per year of carbon removal is going on through the management of forests, through anthropogenic activity in managed forests. But as I said, this includes some natural and indirect fluxes. So we've been making calculations to try and work out, well, if you were just to pull out the direct anthropogenic component from this, what do you get? And you find out that a pretty large component is these indirect fluxes. And the bit that we would call kind of direct CDR through managed forests, according to the inventories, with some extra layers of calculation, is only about a third of that. So we're talking about 2 billion tons per year. Now, if you compare that to the bookkeeping estimates, so the 2 gigatons from the inventories I showed you is now this black line with the shaded region around it. For the global carbon budget, they used 3 bookkeeping models, which I've shown in orange here, and the shaded region is the kind of range from the 3 models. The thick orange line is the mean of those models. We see a not dissimilar result around the 2 gigaton level, but they're certainly not exactly the same answers. And we can see there's a pretty wide uncertainty. We're talking hundreds of millions of tons. But we can see a broadly stable trend in terms of carbon removal through afforestation, reforestation, or broadly managed forests as defined in the inventories. So I think this is still a work in progress to try and pin down this question. We've got 2 different ways of looking at the problem. And actually, one of the things we did was we broke this down to the national level. So we've got a really nice map in the report of where a lot of this afforestation, reforestation is actually occurring, at least according to the bookkeeping models. But when you make this kind of reconciliation between inventories and bookkeeping models, you've got some uncertainty, and when you break that down to the national level, we see those uncertainties really get large in some cases because of the assumptions you have to make. So I'd say this is another loose end. This is a kind of open question. How do we reconcile this and do it well and come to a clear view? So that's the 2 billion tons from conventional land, and that is the lion's share of how much carbon removal we're doing globally, according to our estimates. But of course, we're doing lots of other newer technologies, the stuff which maybe grabs the headlines a little bit more. And we've added up all of those as well. And we get to about 1.3 million tons of CO2 in 2023. That's our estimate. About 0.1% in comparison to this CDR we're doing through growing trees, essentially. So what is this? Well, interestingly, the biggest slug of this, what we call novel CDR, is biochar production. This is happening around the world. There was an international biochar initiative survey that was carried out that found that there are loads of these projects. They tend to be pretty small scale, kind of kiloton scale maximum, and they're spread around the world. A lot of it's happening in the USA, new biochar projects springing up there, but then also spread across Europe, across Asia, across South America, a little bit going on in Oceania and Africa as well. But this is rising fast. If you look at the data for over the last 2 to 3 years, biochar is really on the ascendancy. We've got bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. This is the lighter orange bar. This is essentially 2 plants in the US, in Illinois and the Red Trail project. And they have been, the Illinois project's been going for several years, been kind of running steadily along. So that estimate there is the amount of biogenic CO2 captured and put into geological storage as a result of BECCS. And that's very concentrated at the moment just in these 2 projects in the US. And then you can see we get to these really, really tiny dark bars at the end. We're down to the kiloton scale now. Enhanced rock weathering is actually kind of third in the pecking order in terms of size of current removals. This is spreading minerals on agricultural soils. And this is currently happening in projects in Canada, in India, in Australia, and the UK. And then the tiny, tiny dark bar right on the left-hand side, that's everything else. So that's your direct air carbon capture with durable storage. That's biomass sinking projects. All the other things that you might have heard of, they are right down in this tiny, tiny sliver of the tiny, tiny sliver, as it were. I should say another loose end is that we've basically been taking, in a lot of cases, self-reported removals here. So a really key issue, as I'm sure you're all aware, is how these things are measured, reported, and verified. We don't have globally agreed protocols for a lot of these novel methods, particularly the enhanced rock weathering. National inventories, there's just been sort of supplementary guidance published for biochar. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, the bioenergy component and the CCS components, they're largely captured. But a lot of these new things, we're sort of largely taken as given from the companies or maybe the third-party verifiers, but not completely open source standards as to how much they're removing. So we actually dedicate a chapter in the state of CDR to the whole issue of MRV, and I'd recommend you take a look at that if you're interested. So that's how much we've got. How much might we need? We don't have a crystal ball. There's the famous quote that making predictions is hard, especially about the future. So we can't make a direct forecast about how much we're going to need as part of meeting our climate targets alongside emissions reduction. But of course, the way we do this is we often look at scenarios through models, particularly integrated assessment models, those class of models which try to capture the whole global economy, the demands for energy and services from people now and into the future, and the technologies that might meet them within certain constraints, whether they're temperature limits or carbon budget constraints or whatever. And of course, this is really the primary source of information that the IPCC uses, these integrated assessment models. For a lot of the information we then use on, what's the amount of emissions reduction needed, what mix of technologies is going to be important. But they're not forecasts, they are scenarios. We run them with particular assumptions, we add in technologies, we take them out, we relax certain assumptions, we change others, and we look at future possibilities. There were over 500 scenarios looked at in the last assessment, AR6, the IPCC, and all of them have carbon dioxide removal in them. They all use carbon dioxide removal as well as emissions reductions to meet the kind of targets we talk about when we talk about the Paris Agreement. So below 2 degrees at least, maybe with an even chance of 1.5 degrees. All of them tend to use what we're calling conventional CDR, the land sector, forestry, and so on. Nearly all of them use BECCS, but we do see a certain number of other methods that have started to creep into the AR6 database, direct air capture with storage, enhanced rock weathering, one scenario including biochar. And we've also gathered up about 90 scenarios published since AR6. Really interesting to see that, conventional CDR is still very popular, BECCS still very popular, DAX, proportionally riding higher, more enhanced rock weathering projects, nothing on biochar. I think this is really interesting, given that you see, biochar is currently the largest novel method, as we call it. Scenarios are becoming more diverse in terms of the technology options they have in them, but they're certainly not very diverse, I would say. So that, I think, is an area for future work, and I know there'll be several talks, so several of you are working hard on these integrated assessment models to try and get a reliable representation of these methods, which is a challenge, but I think important for these future scenarios. So what do these scenarios tell us? I'm sure you've all seen many, many line graphs like this before of how we fix the climate problem. These model pathways that are sort of Paris relevant tend to share similar features. So what this pathway shows you is out over the 21st century, we currently are emitting over 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide through fossil fuel use and deforestation. We're emitting a bunch of other non-CO2 greenhouse gases you can see in the purple there. We are doing some removals in the land sector. And these pathways show that essentially as soon as you let the models run free, which is generally from the year 2020, and a lot of these certainly assessed by the IPCC and AR6, as soon as you give them the chance, they immediately start squashing down emissions of fossil CO2 and deforestation. There are a lot of cost-effective ways to do that now, and the models all tell you, get on with them now. And of course, the bulk of the mitigation challenge is achieved by cutting emissions and doing that very rapidly over the next 10 to 20 years. So you can see how much this blue area comes down over the next decade or two. What we also see, though, is that they tend to scale up carbon dioxide removal. And the critical thing is, of course, they need to reach net zero CO2 emissions. That emerges from climate physics. That's what we need to do if we want to limit the global temperature rise. And the way they get down to this dashed line, which is net CO2 down through the zero line, is they scale up carbon removal to the gigaton scale in order to balance out some residual emissions on the time frame that they need to do it. We see less action on the non-CO2 greenhouse gases, and certainly if they pass through net zero greenhouse gases, that's because they're scaling up even more carbon removal. And we also see that the novel CDR methods do come in. They're used by the models, which indicates that they have option value. They're valuable for getting there. Unless there are specific scenario runs, and modelers do this, where they rule out using those technologies, or they rule out using the CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. So then you don't have fossil CCS. You also don't have BECCS and DACs. But I think those are the kind of broad messages we can get from these pathways. And so then, well, a question is, which of these models which of these scenarios, these future possibilities do we choose? And one of the key debates that has come up, you'll all be aware, is how sustainable are some of these pathways, particularly the ones that have high levels of carbon removal in. So there was a piece out in Science by Alexandra Deprez recently talking about the need to consider very carefully the sustainable limits to the amount of carbon dioxide removal that can and should be deployed. And this is not just something that the scientific community is anxious about, but is also baked into the text of the Paris Agreement. So if you look at Article 2, right before talking about the headline temperature goal being well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to 1.5, it says this needs to be done in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. So this is not a kind of nice to have. This is actually baked into the Paris Agreement. And of course, we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which act as a sort of frame and a lens for working out what we mean by sustainable development. So one of the really nice things we've been able to do in the state of CDR, but again, this is, I'd say, is a kind of first start, is to actually try and pull out the subset of all these scenarios, these 630 or so that I showed you, that meet some broader sustainable goals. And the indicators we looked at and selected through are aimed at these particular aspects of sustainability. So maintaining biodiversity and ecosystem services, addressing population at risk of hunger, energy efficiency and access for all, and also restricting the amount of land and water resources needed, in particular by bioenergy. And of course, this is an issue which is relevant to all of pathways. So we didn't just look at the carbon removal component, but we looked at the scenario in its entirety, because sustainability issues are really a cross-cutting set of issues. If you don't let a model use BECCS, but if the model gobbles up all that biomass and just sticks it into aviation fuel, then you're going to end up with a lot of the similar sustainability problems. So this really needs to be looked at holistically, and that's what some of these integrated assessment models give you. So if we apply this additional lens of sustainability, what do we get? Here's a little bar graph which shows you in 2050 what's happening across the whole set of the 630 scenarios. Those are the red bars. The C1 to C3 gives you a kind of indication of the temperature level they end up at. But then this kind of lighter blue set of bars is the comparison for the more sustainable subset that we've pulled out. And it's interesting. I mean, what we see, which may not be a surprise, is that the more sustainable subset tell you go on emissions even harder. So you have, and there is a plot for 2035 in the report as well, which really, really underlines that if you want to follow these more sustainable pathways, you cut emissions faster. But when it comes to carbon removal, they pull out similar amounts of carbon removal. So the story is not necessarily that different in terms of the amount of carbon removal that's in these pathways. If we look at the central range, so the sort of 25th to 75th percentile, we get about 7 to 9 billion tons of CDR in these pathways by the year 2050. But what is interesting is actually the CDR methods they're picking. So it's pushing more towards conventional CDR, the land restoration, the afforestation, if you're keen on sustainability. That's within the subset of scenarios. So I would underline what I said about the kind of menu of CDR options that are currently in these integrated assessment model pathways. Personally, I think it'd be really interesting as we start adding in more of these carbon removal options, these different types of options, how this story might shift. But the message here is that you're more serious about about land restoration as part of your mitigation portfolio if you care about sustainability. And one of the things we did actually, just to sort of aid readers, is we pulled out 3 what we called focus scenarios, and these are from the more sustainable subset, just to try and illustrate the levels and the trade-offs that might be involved if you take different approaches to carbon removal, all within this context of achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. So we picked a more conventional CDR pathway, one which has a greater proportional amount of conventional CDR, one with more novel CDR technologies, and we deliberately pulled out a scenario which has no novel CDR whatsoever, which is quite an extreme scenario in terms of levels of emissions reduction, demand for energy and materials, and low levels of CDR. You can see these shapes and how they map to the sets in general on this plot. But we deliberately wanted to pull out a no novel CDR scenario to see what that tells us. So what we've done is we've plotted those 3 scenarios in the orange here. So 3 different possible visions of the future and how much carbon removal might be involved in meeting particularly the 1.5 degree target actually in these cases. And we've compared that to the little dark gray bar on the left, which is how much CDR we're doing now. We also have stacked up how much CDR we think is in pledges by countries in the year 2030 through their nationally determined commitments, and in the year 2050 through their long-term low emissions scenarios. So these are documents that countries submit as part of the UNFCCC process, the International Climate Negotiations. Now, we estimate some scaling up from just over 2 billion tons now to maybe 2.6 billion tons per year in the year 2030. That's all through conventional CDR, through forestry. We don't find any concrete quantifiable commitments to do any kind of novel CDR technology currently in the NDCs. We do see novel CDR popping up in some of these longer term strategies. They're slightly different to the NDCs in that they're not firm commitments. They're kind of scenarios for how countries intend to achieve broadly net zero in most cases by 2050. So we see more novel CDR in this mix, and we see some more scaling up. But an overall key message here is lack of transparency, actually. It's really hard to do this calculation. There's a lot of missing data in NDCs and long-term strategies. They are not required to explicitly state how much carbon removal they plan to do vis-a-vis emissions reduction. And so we've had to make quite a lot of fairly hairy assumptions. I say there are still loose ends here. We've made the assumption, for instance, that if countries have not said anything about their managed land sinks, they are going to at least maintain them at the same level to the year 2030. But to the extent that holds true, we don't know. What we can see, though, is this is the CDR gap we talk about. If you compare current pledges, at least as submitted to the UNFCCC, with the levels of CDR in these scenarios, then you can see that there's a gap. In the highest case, 2050 here, we're talking a gap of about 5.5 gigatons by the year 2050. Now, I mentioned that we deliberately took a no novel CDR approach And you can see here, this is where the gap is smallest. In fact, if you believe all the long-term emission strategies, maybe we're getting close. So the gap is conditional on the choices we make and the path we follow in the future. I'd be interested to know whether you think these gap numbers are larger or smaller than what you'd expect. There is one really, really important contextual point, which is what's going on emissions reductions in these pathways. And one thing which I think is really important to keep in mind is just the level of emissions reductions that's involved in these scenarios. And of course, if we're not achieving that, then we are falling even further behind in terms of how we're doing on mitigation, both on emissions reductions and removals. One of the points we make is that a lot of these scenarios, certainly the ones in the IPCC database, most of them are set to run from the year 2020. And as I said, they immediately start reducing emissions then. Most scenarios have already peaked in the year 2020. In the real world, we have not peaked in 2020. We're doing very, very badly at this. And of course, what matters is the area under the emissions curve for CO2. It's cumulative emissions that is driving global temperature rise. So to the extent we are overshooting on these pathways currently, we're going to have to undershoot if we want the same climate outcome. And this is really non-trivial at the moment. So if we take the emissions trend just to today, to now, since the year 2020, and the amount by which we've overshot these scenarios already, then if we want to end up with the same climate outcome by the year 2050, we already have to add on what we think is an additional 1.5 billion tons of what we call mitigation effort, because this is arguably mostly an emissions reduction story, but it's either emissions reduction or carbon removal to get us back on track to these pathways. So we are rapidly falling behind in terms of achieving these pathways. And the big story here is about reducing emissions. But to the extent we're not doing that, that is putting more weight onto having to reduce those emissions later, if not now. If we're sensible, we get on with it now. But that's also meaning that we have to really think hard about the amount of carbon removal we're going to have to, we're laying up in store for ourselves. So that's the kind of overall picture in terms of the gap. What I want to do just for a few minutes before I wrap up is look under the hood, because as you will all be aware, there's the global picture, but there is a huge amount of really, really interesting stuff going on with carbon removal. So we set out to kind of tease out some indicators of how is carbon dioxide removal as a global enterprise developing? Can we learn some things about the direction we might be headed, how likely we are to close that gap? So to do this, I'm going to set out, broadly there have been lots and lots of studies on technological innovation, how technologies develop. And in a very, very broad nutshell, they say, well, there's a bunch of supply factors and there's a bunch of demand factors. Supply factors which influence how much carbon dioxide removal it's possible to do. How many projects do we have? How many technologies do we have that could be used? And then we've got a bunch of demand factors. So how much do people want to actually deploy those? How much are they being pulled through to delivery? And we can think of a whole bunch of things in the supply bucket. So research and development is a crucial one. Research, development, innovation means that we increase the stock of knowledge, the stock of possibilities for methods we could look at, understanding how they work, the benefits, the trade-offs, and so on. Then there are demonstration projects and scaling up, so actually building things, pieces of kit on the ground in the ocean, and seeing how they work. And then the process of innovation involves often scaling those into bigger plants, from going from first of a kind to second of a kind to nth of a kind. And then in terms of demand factors, what influences how much these technologies and behaviors might scale up? Quite often you have these niche markets. You have these places where people are early adopters, or there's a value for the product which is pretty high but is pretty small. And then you get demand pulled through to mass market for those technologies and behaviors that are successful. And what's really, really crucial, of course, is what publics, potential buyers or people who might be affected by these things, think of them. If they're popular, then there's going to be more demand. But quite a lot of the time, people can decide they don't want them. And that has a huge influence, of course, on how technologies develop. So this is kind of a very, very broad, high-level kind of view of how we can think about these things, not just for carbon dioxide removal, but for a bunch of other technologies that are going to be important for fixing climate change. And it's really important to say this is a really non-linear process, right? So if publics, we've actually seen real cases where publics have quite strong views about research and development projects at super early stages, and that can affect how R&D develops. We've seen how niche markets influence scale-up, kind of early adopters who are willing to pay a premium for things. So there's a whole bunch of feedbacks in here. But I'm just going to show a few slides on some of the things we've looked at on the supply side and some of the things we've looked at on the demand side. First, supply, R&D. This is what a lot of you are involved in. And maybe a reason why a lot of you are here is because, of course, more money is going into R&D for carbon dioxide removal. Currently, we see the number of active grants is up around in the sort of thousands range globally that we could find. And the amount of money going into public research grants is of the order of sort of $250 million US now. And a really interesting part of this picture is where that money is going in terms of different carbon dioxide removal methods. Back in the early 2000s, it was a strong trees and soil story. And of course, ocean fertilization was comparatively a big thing then. Comparatively, because of course, we're talking a 100% fraction here of these small numbers down in 2000. And over time, we've seen actually a really big uptick in biochar research. There's a lot of research going on, a lot in Asia, actually. And of course, we've got DAX making a run for it towards the end. So we're seeing a diversification in the range of methods that's being looked at. If we also look then at what's happening kind of on the business side of things, we look at innovation and patenting. We've also looked at startups. This is a really interesting story. I mean, just over 3 times the amount of money on research grants has gone into startups in the year 2023. We pulled this data from a database called Net Zero Insights. And what you can see from the bars here is what's happened to investments in CDR startups over the years. This dashed line is investment actually in low carbon, zero carbon, carbon removal startups as a whole, so mitigation startups. Again, there's a really interesting diversity story. So if you look at the colors of these bars, we're seeing a broader range of methods actually being invested in at the startup stage. DAX got a lot of attention in the year 2022. This has actually come down from 2022 to 2023. So investment went down in carbon removal in the year 2023. But this is actually a picture we see more broadly across the whole of the low carbon space. And if you look at how much money is going into carbon removal as a total for all sort of climate tech investment, it's about 1%. So about 1% of the investment in startups and climate tech as a whole is going into carbon removal. It's really interesting if you look at the announcements these companies are making. A lot of companies have some pretty big plans for how much carbon removal they claim to deliver that they're putting out in the public domain. I won't do a show of hands for how many people believe these pledges. But if you actually add these all up, so all these dots are pledges we found, and then the dash line at the top, and note this is a logarithmic scale. The dash line is, if you just naively take the sum of all of these, how much carbon removal will we get to? You're getting in the realm, actually maybe at the top end of the realm, of how much carbon removal is in these 1.5, 2 degree pathways. Maybe that's good news, certainly shows a lot of ambition. I think the reason why there's maybe a bit of a laugh is, okay, companies, they're in the business to talk a good game. But also a really big uncertainty comes from the demand side. How much demand is there for this? How much is there a viable long-term business model for these kind of carbon removal methods? And that's a really important other side of the story. So just briefly, many of you will know that a lot of activity, especially for these novel CDR methods, is going on through the voluntary carbon markets and voluntary carbon purchases. So this is not governments regulating for it to happen. This is companies who are saying, we're going to get on the front foot and we're going to buy credits from these companies. And of course, currently carbon removal is expensive. So the table here is of weighted average prices in 2022 and 2023 for these different methods, which are currently now selling carbon credits. And if you compare these to the average price of a credit you can get on a voluntary carbon market for an emissions reduction project, a wind farm or something like that, even the afforestation, reforestation credits are something like 3 times more expensive. When you get into these newer techs, you see these really high numbers. We're talking order 100 times more expensive. So this stuff is still expensive. And most of this demand is being driven by the voluntary market, which is pretty fragile. You will have seen, various scandals about the voluntary carbon market, not necessarily carbon removal as a whole, but the way voluntary carbon markets are run and are used. If you look at estimates, there are really wide-ranging estimates for how much carbon removal demand there might be through voluntary pledges, but Boston Consulting Group came up with an estimate 40 to 100 million tons of CO2 per year. We did a separate estimate with Connor Hickey and co-authors here at Oxford. If you stack up the current amount from governments, so what we call compliance markets or compliance mechanisms, we're talking the US 45Q, the Swedish reverse auctions for BECCS, the Californian low carbon fuel standards, we got to, at maximum, if you were super optimistic, maybe 100 million tons by 2030. So both these numbers are an order of magnitude smaller than the amounts that you saw in the announcements by companies in the previous slide. So this issue of demand is a really live question, and whether the structures will be put in place to pull through these technologies to scale, the ones we want. The other crucial thing, and I'll wrap up very soon, but I find that the public perception stuff personally just really fascinating as a recovering physicist. So we track several things in the work we did on public perceptions in the report. One of the things is the conversations on Twitter. How many tweets broadly of what sentiment? What are they talking about? For the first time, we also looked at print media articles. And we're seeing huge, rapidly growing awareness, right? So if we look at tweets, there are about 5 times more tweets than there were 6 or 7 years ago about carbon removal. You may say, well, that's just the growth of social media, but we see a similar factor of growth actually in print media. And again, there's a really diverse picture of what people are talking about in terms of methods. Broadly, the sentiment is positive. So we see a similar picture in 2021 to 2022, so a similar picture from the first edition of the State of CDR to the second edition. Both in terms of the numbers, they seem to have stabilized a little bit, but also in terms of the broad sentiment. So we find overall, again, the Twitter conversation is about 1% of the overall conversation on climate. The number of tweets on carbon removal is about 1% of overall sort of climate tweets. And we see broadly positive sentiment with the exception of ocean fertilization. More people tweet with a downer on ocean fertilization than pleased about it. And we see broadly actually that the trends have been moving towards more positive sentiment over time, with the exception of BECCS. So BECCS has been more positive than negative, but actually that's become less positive over time. So some really interesting individual trends in there. And one of the things I found really fascinating in this report, some of our co-authors did, was actually dug into the literature on what drives people's public perceptions about carbon removal. And so this bar chart shows of the 198 pieces of evidence they could find in the literature where academic researchers have gone out and asked people about carbon dioxide removal and why they think what they think. There are some really common things that come up across the literature, a few things that come up less often. And they've looked at which things have a really strong relationship. So these things really strongly determine whether people view a given carbon dioxide removal or CDR in general positively, or whether there's kind of mixed results, weak, no relationship, or maybe even an inverse relationship. And we can see the things that come out really strongly are perceived naturalness and making sure that what we do doesn't screw up ecosystems and biodiversity. And naturalness is a kind of contested space. I mean, you will see, it's interesting that a lot of people talk about enhanced rock weathering now as a natural process, because arguably it is. It's enhancing Earth's rock cycle. But I think part of the motivation there is, hey, it's a natural process. People like natural processes. Going down here, I won't dwell on it too long, but we can see, for instance, this idea, doing carbon dioxide removal, is it a moral hazard? Does it take focus away from emissions reductions in a bad way? Really interesting. That's not the first thing that comes up. It's here, and it's mixed. We see some evidence of a strong relationship, some evidence of an inverse relationship. So if you talk about carbon dioxide removal, in some cases, maybe that underlines the importance of reducing emissions in the first place. This is pretty much my last slide. It's a bit of a complicated one, but it attempts to gather together some of these drivers on the supply and the demand side and give a picture of where CDR is headed. I've touched on scenarios. I've touched on investments and current deployment and national proposals of CDR in 2030. One of the really strong pictures we found was around the diversity of methods being looked at different stages in the development chain for CDR. Now, from what I showed you, we're pretty confident that we're going to need carbon dioxide removal at the gigaton scale, along with huge amounts of emissions reductions if we're serious about our climate targets. We don't really know the precise mix of carbon dioxide removal that we want, but we know we'll probably need it soon. We know that different methods have different levels of durability, different costs, benefits, trade-offs. So any economist would tell you, well, what you do if you're trying to invest under uncertainty like that is you take a portfolio approach. You push multiple things. You don't put all your eggs into one basket because we don't quite know what wins and we want to give ourselves a good chance of success. We see that diversity pretty strongly in research grant funding, arguably in patents. Investments is pretty diverse. It's quite heavily weighted towards the fact that there were big investments in direct air carbon capture and storage just recently. Scenarios, as I said, so the tools we use to actually look at the possibilities of the future, they're a bit more limited. And when you get through to what's currently being deployed and what governments are pledging to do, at least in the UNFCCC process over the next decade or so, suddenly that diversity really washes out. So I think that's quite a strong message from what we found in the data. And we would argue that taking a portfolio approach and pulling that portfolio through to all stages of development is going to be quite important in the coming years. I just want to wrap up by thanking the huge number of contributors we had to this report. Many of you are in the room, so thank you. And I hope I represented your work well enough. But we had a really fantastic team from all around the world and multiple different disciplines. And that really helped the report to be what it is. But as I hope I've pointed out, there are some loose ends. There is more work to do. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you through that. Thank you to our funders who helped make it happen as well. We've got a data portal. I just wanted to give this a little plug. So we've tried to make all the data behind the report, or as much of it as we can, publicly available. This is available, hosted by EASA, but you can find it if you go to the website, www.stateofcdr.org. Have a play around. Hopefully this is useful to you. I would say this is kind of in beta mode at the moment. If any of you want to volunteer to have a play around and give us feedback on what's working, what's not working, so we can make it better, do please let me know, let one of the lead authors know, because we'd love to have your help in just giving it a bit of a road test, kicking the tires on it. But I am going to finish there. So thank you very much to all of you. Have a good conference. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Steve. Proving, I guess, that like Clark Kent, or perhaps unlike Clark Kent, you're not a humanoid alien from the planet Krypton. But that's fantastic work. I'm going to prioritize questions on the app. Sorry. And other than the question, what's the best pasta, which has already been answered, I'm going to leave you in suspense. If you're not on the app, you're not going to know. So the top-ranked question, I'm sort of afraid to say, because I won't tell you who asked it, is what are the biggest barriers in the way of us scaling from 2 gigatons a year up to 10 gigatons a year? Are they tech, economic, social, legal, or something else?
Oh, gosh. I mean, it is a bit of all of them, as I showed. If you pinned me against the wall and told me I had to pick a small set, I would say that the lack of demand, especially through governments, is a really big one. Carbon dioxide removal is essentially a public good. We're going out into the environment and tidying up the waste we've left there, which is kind of, and we have arrangements with governments, through our local governments, to do bin collection, to do litter collection. So I think this is something that doesn't have a natural market. So I think we need governments to step up to the plate. And in fairness, while the commitments in their NDCs and so on are pretty lightweight, there are countries, as we know, who are very actively looking at this at the national scale. But we're not there yet in terms of having the kind of demand that will schedule it. What comes with that is the MRV piece. Some of these are at really early stages, and there are some really still fundamental science questions as to being confident that the kind of underlying physics and chemistry of a lot of them makes sense. But knowing where the carbon price precisely goes, over what time scale, and being sure that it stays where you want it to be and doesn't screw up other things with a level of confidence which allows governments to then fund them, I think is going to be crucial.
Super, thank you very much. I'm feeling slightly like an Uber driver here. I'm just being told what to do by an AI or something. But currently, or by you, because you're voting on stuff. But the next top-ranked question is from Annette Cowie. Thank you, Annette. Future growth of trees is uncertain under climate change, especially with respect to age class distribution. CO2 fertilization helps, but it is limited by water and nutrient availability. How likely is it that forest sinks are going to be maintained in the mid to long term?
Great point. And hello, Annette. I assume you're tuning in online at some godforsaken time in Australia. Annette was one of our scientific steering committee members, so she's been a huge help, even though she's not here in person. Yes, if I'd had more time, one of the slides I would love to have shown is actually digging a bit more into the amount of forest-based CDR, the conventional CDR, in these NDCs and these long-term strategies. And what you see is fascinating and shows you that it's not a given that we're even going to hit those levels of conventional CDR. So the areas where we currently see a lot of kind of human sink in forestry are China, the US, Europe, a few other places. And then you can look at the trend of what's been going on in those locations for the last 20 years. Often, I mean, China's actually doing incredibly well, largely for reasons of sort of preventing desertification in the north, as I understand it. But you can see their land sink has really been increasing. The US and Europe, I think it's a bit more kind of level or maybe even going up a bit. And then you see this aim for where they're headed for, where they're pledged to head for in 2050. And you see a really big increase in the land sink, actually. And I think given all the factors that Annette spoke about in a changing climate, it's really important to underline that this isn't just a novel CDR tech story, but there are going to be major challenges in actually maintaining and expanding our land sinks in a good way.
Now, there's a super question on startups, which we'll come to in a sec, but while we're still talking about forests, Duncan McLaren has asked, is it realistic and responsible to characterize all of those 2 gigatons we've just been talking about of direct forest removals as actually being additional?
Is it realistic and responsible? Well, I think we're... so if you take the definition of carbon dioxide removal, especially as espoused by the likes of the IPCC, so we can argue the toss, but definitely some level of authority, it's capture of CO2 durably through human activities in various carbon reservoirs, including the land reservoir. So I think afforestation, reforestation fits that bill. I think there are really interesting questions about what's actually driving that. I mentioned China, where it's policy, but it's not explicitly climate policy, although I'm sure climate is in there. There are a lot of areas where agricultural land is being released and returned back to forest. And the extent to which you want to call that deliberate CDR for the aims of meeting climate goals, I think then you get into murky waters. But then actually, do we really want to say that CDR is only CDR when people intend to do it? I'm not sure. I think this is something that reasonable people can debate. But if the goal is to stabilize the climate system, whether we do that intentionally or unintentionally, I'm kind of neutral about that. So yeah, there are questions about how we define it. I think hopefully I explained, and I really wanted to explain, that we strip out a lot of indirect effects in our calculation, and we have removed. Another question that comes up is, our country is just getting more and more CDR from land by annexing more land and calling it managed. So we've tried to explicitly address that and strip that out of the calculation. But yes, the kind of motives and what's driving these forest trends, I think, is an interesting question we can argue the toss about.
You're making me think of some economic theory by Professor Meg Meyer there, but that's for another day.
Oh, okay.
So let me move on to the startup question. So you showed, and I was fascinated by the amount of money being invested. This is from Veronica Fury. So the money going into startups removing CO2, is it representative of the actual amount of CO2 being removed, or is it so early, or is it just that actually venture capitalists are backing those who are, it's very expensive to remove CO2, so we're not actually getting necessarily more removal. So that flows of capital representative of anything, do you think?
Well, yeah.
Other than
if
flows
people
capital.
want to have interpretations of that data, I'd love to hear them. It's almost certainly not representative of the amount of CO2 coming out of the atmosphere. I mean, if you look at the money going into startups and think back to how much carbon removal is going on, a lot of it has been a DAX story in terms of investments in the last 2 years.
Right.
We're starting to see that in terms of new projects. So, the Mammoth project in Iceland, we're going to see, if all goes well in the US, more DAX plants operational very soon. So the money is turning into something, but it's clearly not a one-to-one relationship between amount of money in and amount of carbon removal out. DAX is proving very popular, but I think it is really important to underline just how small the scale is compared to some of these other methods.
And just a quick follow-up, this is my one, sorry. Why do you think we saw that big drop-off from 2022 to 2023?
Oh, why do you think? I'm not sure.
Well, I would guess, I mean, there was a general shift in funding environment in that year. We had the kind of anti-woke, anti-ESG. I imagine it probably got caught up in some of that, but I don't know. It was a genuine question.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I was aware that there's been a general downturn in investment in climate things, so I wasn't surprised to see a downturn in the CDR data. But yeah, if anyone knows the reasons behind that and whether we expect that to be, a secular decline, how long that's going to last, I think that's an interesting question.
All right, top ranked question. We'll have to wrap up soon, but from Julio Liponen, sorry, my shabby pronunciation. Do you think VCM, so voluntary carbon markets, can really be a main driver here, or do we need more government purchases of removals? And I guess in a sense you've partly addressed that already. But
yeah, I mean, kind of yes and yes. It is
supposed to be either or, but
it's the main driver, certainly in terms of the variegation of removals. So for those really new early stage methods, it is the VCM or bilateral deals that's driving that stuff. Is voluntary action. My own personal view is we shouldn't rely on the VCM, and I think we're only going to get to gigaton scale if we have more government mechanisms, whether that's inclusion in an emissions trading scheme or another incentive or a direct obligation, which it could be. But I think, and I think we mentioned this in the report, there's likely to always be a role for the VCM, because there's always going to be innovation. Hopefully there will always be innovation, both in terms of the actual methods that can deliver removals, but also how we kind of measure them and the protocols around them. So I would hope that I hope that the VCM can overcome some of the real problems it's got. And I hope that it could continue being a source of innovation that is then a source of learning, but that governments pick up that learning and they become probably the main show in the long run.
Okay, we're almost out of time. I'm going to take 3 more questions, one from online. I'm going to ask for 2, controversially, sorry, Michael, from the room. And just given that you've had 2 men chatting to each other, if we can have a question from a woman and possibly a question from somebody about the Global South. So have a think about that while I'm picking up Samantha Tanz's question here, which is very highly voted. There are a lot of questions here. Well done, all of you. I'm afraid we're going to not do you full justice. But so Samantha says, do you think including unintentional CDR, so forestry, harvested wood products, etc., distorts the perceived scalability of land-based CDR? Because, of course, what's going on intentionally represents hundreds of years of human intervention for various reasons rather than removing CO2.
I think Samantha's probably in the room, and I know she's written papers. Hello, Samantha. You would argue that intentionality should be part of the definition, maybe, of CDR. As I said, I mean, so regressing back to my physicist, part of me wants to say intentionality doesn't matter. What matters is the outcomes on the carbon cycle. But I do think to the question of scaling, yes, it probably does matter about intentionality. Because there's only so far you get by doing things accidentally. But I think countries clearly are now being intentional about their forest sink, certainly in the context of NDCs and the UNFCCC. So while we've seen humans do things on the land and that has consequences for many, many decades, I think it probably is kind of front of mind for many policymakers, those involved in climate, but also those in policymaking. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily do a whole lot better at it. So yeah, I would take your point about intentionality being important for thinking about forward-looking. I think we will continue to do a bunch of things accidentally. But yes, I'm now wishing I showed that slide on kind of the gap between current trends in land and where we need to get to, at least by country pledges, because it shows that we're not going to get that if we just kind of bimble along how we've been doing the last few decades.
Great. So opportunities for a question from Joe House. Hands up fast at the front. So Michael, can we have a mic over to Joe? And then a Global South, if you're kind of plausibly, yes, we've got hopefully a Global South question. Yeah, okay, great. Joe.
Thanks. It actually maybe picks up a bit on the intentionality and one of the things you raised. So just to say that IPCC have methods for like abandoned agricultural land due to war, doesn't count as anthropogenic activity, so it counts as non-intentional. You have to show the intent to change to forest. But my question was about your scenarios that were most sustainable tend to have a lot more afforestation and conventional CDR. Is that because the sustainability is looking more at biodiversity, and how does the food versus fuel thing work out with that? Because of course more afforestation means less land for food. So was there any digging down into those scenarios to actually look what was going on there about the food SDG?
Yeah. I
Thanks
could.
very much, Joe.
Oh, do you want to take?
No, you go ahead.
I could take that answer, but actually Matt Giddens is in the audience and he was deeply involved in that analysis. So Michael, I just wonder whether we could pass the microphone first to, maybe not. She's in the
Sorry. Steve's giving you some exercise, Mike. Oh, no, there's another
Sarah,
one. Great.
could you pass to Matt? Yeah, because I think Matt will probably give a better answer than me.
Yeah, hi. Does that work now?
Yeah.
Great. Hi, everybody. Matthew Giddens from EASA worked closely with Steve on the State of CDR on the Scenarios chapter. So the way that we tried to tackle this question was to look at as many dimensions of sustainability simultaneously as we could. The strong caveat here is that for those who have worked with scenario data in the past, you will know that you will not get the exact answer generally that you're looking for, but you have to sort of look at broad other considerations. So for example, area for afforestation and reforestation. One of the things that we specifically did for this analysis was do a bespoke estimate of population at risk of hunger. So this is one of the scenario outcomes for which some scenarios provide this information. But we worked with the team based in Japan, Tomoko Hasegawa and colleagues, to explicitly look at what would be broadly the issue around trade-offs with food, basically. And we explicitly looked at scenarios that strongly decreased the population at risk of hunger compared to today. So we did try to take on some of these aspects. Again, no analysis, fundamentally, I think it's important to note that we're dealing with an unstructured set of scenarios. So the best thing to do would actually be to have teams run scenarios with these specific questions in mind. But given the data that we have, I think we did the best that we could to try to capture these trade-offs and quantify them, and then only assess scenarios that we felt more confident would not see strong trade-offs, for example, between land area for afforestation, land area for fuel, and land area for food.
Great, thanks, Matt. I guess in summary, we still haven't found what we're looking for, but you're certainly doing a great job of looking. So sorry, I couldn't. The last question, there. Yes, great, go ahead.
I just have a question regarding the Global South. Do you have a view on how CDR can promote money flowing to the Global South and how that can be integrated to compliance markets in the Global North, given that they're not, most compliance markets only allow domestic carbon credits?
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, great question, thank you. It's interesting, I think you touched on, I thought you were going voluntary carbon markets and then you mentioned compliance markets. So we have a map of voluntary carbon market projects and their global distribution in the report. And I think, if I remember rightly, a lot of them still happen in the Global North, which was a bit of a surprise to me. We're seeing some really interesting, just at the level of anecdotal examples, some really interesting moves on carbon removal in perhaps slightly unexpected areas. So many of you will be aware of a direct air capture project which is being started up in Kenya in the Rift Valley. They've got volcanic rocks. Someone from there described it as like Iceland, but with better weather. So, so DAX is, and they see that as a way of attracting investment and also helping to build out the tap the geothermal energy resource they have that can then be used by other industries and people in the area. I mentioned that enhanced rock weathering, one of the few places that got started on it earlier is in India. So Marti Carbon, they're coming on Thursday as part of the business discussion we have. So they're actually on the front foot with some of these methods, but that's kind of at the anecdotal project level. With compliance markets, yes, you're right. They tend to require projects to happen domestically in order to count for domestic markets. And interestingly, from my own perspective working in the UK government, there's often quite a strong argument that the UK has a responsibility to act itself and sort out its own carbon footprint because of its historical responsibility. Now, I'd really like to hear your perspective on that, because a counter-argument is, well, that there might be opportunities, and the government does actually fund projects elsewhere, but when it comes to meeting its own carbon targets and its compliance mechanisms for doing that, emissions trading systems and so on, it's quite strong on keeping them internal, actually for reasons of sort of global equity and justice. Now, I know that's not always the case, so the Californian Low Carbon Fuel Standard has the option for people to meet it through carbon removal, and as I understand it, that can be from projects anywhere in the world. So there are areas where, you know, anyone theoretically, if they have a project that fits the bill anywhere in the world, could access that money.
Well, that's it, folks. So we've got tea and coffee and snacks outside. I just want, before you disappear, please join me in thanking Steve for a fantastic overview of those.